Welcome everybody to part 3 of chapter 2, the video. I'm going to continue here on some material. I want to remind you that I'm just highlighting some things from chapter 2. Do not depend on these lectures solely as the basis of your material to prepare for the quizzes. You're definitely going to want to read a couple of times, every chapter. You want to study the words that are in italics. You want to make your own notes and add to them as you read. I also wanted to mention that at the back of each chapter, they have key concepts and words. Be sure you know all of those as well. Well, what I want to talk about in this part 3 is about the history and the evolution of social welfare, and I want to just hit on some highlights. Uh, the day that we live in here, it's just normal to feel like, well, it's always been this way. How we care for people, to what degree we care for people, who provides that care, that it's just always been the way that it is. Well, in reality, social welfare has undergone an evolution. It changes. It changes for sometimes long periods of time. Sometimes the change is rapidly. So I'm going to just hit on a few highlights and a few dates, but be sure you go back into the text and read the whole section on the history and evolution of social welfare. If we start back at colonial times, obviously there wasn't a highly structured government situation, and even after the Revolutionary War, the federal government to no significant degree was involved in social welfare. You have mainly an agrarian society in the 1700s, and the individual family really did need to provide for itself. The roles were very clearly defined, who did what within the family, and every person was important. The husband, the wife, grandparents, children, grandchildren, everyone worked, everyone contributed. It wasn't like in today's society that a lot of contribution isn't made by the younger people until they've gone through high school and college and maybe a graduate program, and then they move into the workforce. It was a very different time back in colonial days. From a very young age, you were an important and participating person in the welfare of the family. But you did have something that is referred to as mutual aid, and you want to remember that term, mutual aid. Occasionally things happened that went beyond the ability of an individual family to remedy. There may have been a fire, a home or a barn might have burnt down. And so those in the surrounding area, the surrounding community, because there really wasn't big cities so much back then, they rallied together to help that individual family. They had a barn raising. They took a couple of days away from their own work and went and helped out. That is a form of mutual aid. That began to change, though, as we got into the mid 1800s and the early 1900s. Those of you who know your history, you know what happened. The Industrial Revolution. Machinery was invented that made work much quicker, much faster, and greater capacity out on the farmlands. So you began to have people move off of the land and head towards cities. Cities began to grow rapidly. But as people moved to cities, there began to be problems. There weren't jobs readily available for everyone, and society was undergoing a great evolution. So there began to be needs because people didn't have jobs, didn't have places to live, weren't able to pay for it, and society began grappling, how are we going to meet these needs? And with early social welfare problems, there were kind of two competing influences, and you need to know both of these. There was the Puritan ethic, which was the idea that it is in the Bible that everyone needs to work and work hard, that God loves a working man, and you need to take care of yourself. If you were not able to take care of your family, then you somehow must be displeasing to God. Somehow you're in sin. Because obviously, if you work hard, you keep God's commandments, God's going to bless you, and you'll be able to provide for yourself and for your family. So when someone was unable to provide for themselves, this kind of influence looked at them that they were lazy, slothful, sin, somehow in the disfavor of God. Well, how much are you going to want to help a person like that? But there was a competing influence called the French Enlightenment. That influence there, the assumption was that people weren't inherently bad or sinners, and that assistance was not related to morality, that it wasn't people having a moral deficit, that there was other things that could happen in the structure of society, in nature, that might cause a situation that a person would be in need. So you need to be aware of that. Also, I want to mention, as you read through these chapters, not just chapter 2, but any chapter, anytime a person is mentioned, like for instance in this chapter, Dorothea Dix, you want to know who that person is and what they were known for. Every profession has their heroes, they have their pioneers, and in an introduction to any profession, when they list people, you got to figure that those people are important. So be sure you make notes on those people as you go through these chapters. Dorothea Dix was an early social reformer, so I want to make sure that you go in and take a look at her and get to know her. As we move into the late 1800s, the early 1900s, there begin to be formed, not from the federal government, but social welfare organizations. You have the charity organization societies that began in New York City. You have the settlement house movement beginning in Chicago, which a very famous social worker, Jane Addams, who went on to actually win the Nobel Peace Prize, started a movement in terms of helping immigrants, and not just helping them getting food and clothing and things like that, but helping to provide education, child care, early education for kids, some of the first kindergarten classes, and then including social and recreational events. It was quite revolutionary. So these began to spring up because as of that point, the federal government was still not involved. However, when we get to the 1930s and the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, and things became so difficult that we could no longer just believe that it was people being lazy, that there was something morally deficient with them. Too many people were in a situation that they needed help. And in the 1930s, you have the federal government for the very first time with Franklin Delano Roosevelt getting involved on a national level in the social welfare of a nation's citizens. And you have many different laws and programs passed under the New Deal, as it was called, to help people. Unemployment insurance. Many different things were put in place then. Some are still helping people today. And so the federal government, got involved in a big way. When we begin to reach into the recovering from the 1930s, we have a period of great prosperity as we move into the 50s and the 1960s. There was more of a liberal philosophy dominating the government. And not are we just looking at being able to have everybody fed and clothed and sheltered. We want to go farther than that. We want people to more help achieve some of those higher needs. We want to provide people with recreational opportunities, with educational opportunities. Head Start began then. And there was a lot of rights movements, the civil rights movement, the Indian rights movement, the women's movement, the student movement, and people began to be concerned with the individual rights and seeing that there was a more equitable distribution of wealth in the country. After the Vietnam War began, though, things began to turn, and a more conservative tide began to roll and become dominant. You have the conservative philosophy reemerging, especially through Ronald Reagan, who wanted then to lead the effort to limit government involvement in social welfare and, in fact, to dismantle those programs to whatever degree is possible. And have several administrations where that philosophy, whether in the presidency or in the Congress was dominant. Be sure to look at the social evolution of social welfare in the textbook there. All right, that's it. Bye.